Hello and welcome to TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, June 16th, and we have a great show for you. We have the Advisory Committee Chair, Dennis Doughty, and we're going to talk about the most recently completed town meeting and several issues that were debated and resolved on the Zoom floor of town meeting. But first, as always, we've got news, and we're going to start with international news as borders have changed. Canada and Denmark have ended a decades-long dispute over the tiny, barren, uninhabited Hans Island located north of the Arctic Circle. After decades of rivalry, the two nations are set to sign a deal dividing sovereignty of the island, thus creating a new Danish-Canadian land border. The United States House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol meets again this week. Investigations show that the Trump campaign's false claims of a rigged election brought in $250 million for a non-existent donation fund, which gave $5 million to a corporation responsible for the January 6th rally that preceded the Capitol riot. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court has removed from November's ballot a question regarding the status and benefits of app-based drivers for companies such as Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash. The proposed ballot question would have, if passed, allowed companies to refrain from giving drivers employee benefits. Following the House's lead, the Massachusetts Senate voted to override Governor Baker's veto on the Work and Family Mobility Act. Now passed into law, all residents of Massachusetts may apply for a standard driver's license regardless of immigration status beginning July 1, 2023. Health officials have confirmed more monkeypox cases have been detected in Massachusetts, bringing the statewide total to 4. Boston Mayor Michelle Wu has rejected a proposal to cut $10 million from the police overtime budget, arguing that state law requires full compensation for all overtime work. The 2022 U.S. Open takes place this week at the Country Club in Brookline from this past Monday until Sunday, June 19th. And on Sunday, June 19th, we will be celebrating Juneteenth. Celebrations in Brookline begin at 345 Harvard Street, Florida Ruffin Ridley School at 10 a.m. and will proceed to the Brookline Avenue Playground. And that's the news for the week. We're going to kick over to a pre-recorded interview with Advisory Committee Chair Dennis Doughty to talk about some of the results from town meeting. See you on the flip side. And as I mentioned, on today's TV on TV here on Brookline Interactive Group, we have the chair of the advisory committee, Dennis Doughty. We're going to talk about town meeting. We're not going to talk about all the town meeting. We're just going to home in on a few interesting articles. Dennis, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. It's nice to see you.
And, you know, we kind of start with every guest the same. What the hell have you been doing your whole life? What brings you to this conversation?
Zoom brings me to this conversation. I am the chair of the advisory committee, recently selected at the start of this calendar year. I've been in town meeting for 12 or 13 years now, pretty active participant, and I've been on the advisory committee for the past 6 or 7 years. The advisory committee, as you know, is responsible for both reviewing and submitting the budget, the annual budget for the town, and in reviewing and offering reports, opinions, and recommendations on the majority of warrant articles and motions that come before town meeting.
And there were something like 35 warrant articles. A few didn't get moved. A few were done in pairs. Town meeting took 7 nights, maybe 6.5 is more accurate. A few of the articles I felt were sufficiently complex and interesting that talking about it one more time, particularly for folks who are not town meeting members, who are not involved in the process, might be interesting. And I want to start with warrant articles 12 and 13. which could, I guess, be described as the CDRCR discrimination review process. Can you give us a sense on what was at stake here? What were these articles about?
So back in 2019, town meeting member Arthur Conquest sponsored a warrant article which passed overwhelmingly, that gave the chief diversity officer the responsibility of investigating discrimination complaints that would come before him. It was somewhat vague in terms of how the process would work, and what avenues, what mechanisms he would have at his disposal to be able to do the investigations and issue the various reports. And so very quickly, that particular recommendation was put on hold. So the implementation date was pushed out, and it was pushed out in part to give the diversity officer and the committee on diversity, inclusion, and community relations the opportunity to formulate a set of policies and guidelines for how they would go about doing this. And the official deadline for that to take effect was going to be July 1st of this year. And so at the town meeting, the annual town meeting, which we just completed, we were presented with the fruits of roughly 2.5 year process to come up with guidelines and recommendations for how we would actually investigate discrimination complaints. And so that resulted in warrant articles 12 and 13. What was actually at stake was a little bit more subtle than just will we investigate complaints or will we not investigate complaints. What was at stake is how will we go about doing that? Because on July 1st, the responsibility was shifting to the chief diversity officer, and he had a responsibility to respond. The debate that happened in the weeks and months actually leading up to town meeting had to do with specific provisions within the two warrant articles. There were some pretty heated discussions revolving around core elements of due process, who the guidelines would apply to, whether the committee would have subpoena power, whether it would be able to actually issue fines, how the committee would be appointed, so relationships between the executive branch and the legislative branch. We can go into some of that if you like. I don't want to just kind of monologue for 3 or 4 minutes.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time. So what I do want to sort of say is, the motion, this proposal, the town meeting voted to refer it 153 to 96 with four abstentions, excuse me. I have 2 questions about that. The first is, since that means it is not the law, what happens now if there is what happens, June 15th or July 1st, if there is a discrimination complaint? Does the person have no recourse?
So we asked this question during public hearings, because what was it? What I believe the proponents of the warrant article believed and hoped was that this would pass. That while we were technically waiting for approval from the Attorney General's office to make sure that all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed, that this provided a guideline for how complaints would be adjudicated. And so we might start engaging with individuals that had discrimination complaints under the understanding that we were likely to be following a process that, if it was not exactly what was voted, would end up being substantially similar to what was voted. It was not voted. And so what is most likely to happen in the intervening period is that the chief diversity officer is more likely to act, I believe, as an ombudsman, as they have been doing, while they put together a different set of guidelines for how the office will operate. So the simple answer to your question is it hasn't been 100% decided. There hasn't been a statement from CDICR on exactly what will happen when someone comes in with a complaint. But I think what's most likely to happen is ombudsmanship support, helping to navigate through the state's process. But there will not be, at least until another warrant article comes through, there will not be an official investigation that involves, subpoenas and fines and things like that.
And the more technical question, does a vote to refer kill it? How do we interpret what it means the town meeting voted to refer this, and to whom did they refer it, if you recall?
They referred it to the Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. Which is the same process that actually produced the warrant articles in the first place. The proponents of, at least some of the proponents of Articles 12 and 13 have made the statement that a vote to refer is really a vote to kill the warrant article. Many of the people who voted to refer would say no. The warrant articles were quite close to something that could be supported by a broad cross section of town meeting, but there were a small number of items that still remain to be resolved. And the two most notable, in which almost all of the discussion at town meeting had to do with whether the investigating body would have the legal authority to subpoena witnesses, and whether if it found that there had been discrimination, whether it could issue a fine, and what the characteristics of that fine would be. Would it be a $300 fine per day of violation? How do you define that? There were senses that the clarity was not there in terms of the finding process. And many of the people who were opposed to fines were concerned that given state law and legal precedents, that the fines might end up, I apologize, my phone just rang, that the fines might end up being disproportionately assessed to small businesses rather than large businesses. And so the hope is that what will actually happen is that another warrant article will come back in an upcoming town meeting that will correct those items.
Well, thank you. So we're going to move on to a continuation of a debate that has been sort of on again, off again for quite some time, and that is grass versus artificial turf. Of course, the town has a variety of park and open space resources. Some of those have artificial turf now. Skyline Park and Downs Field come to mind. I guess Lower Sewell is also turf. And then more recently, we have seen turf installed in the play spaces at public schools. And I'm not thinking big ball fields necessarily, but there's a smaller multi-use pitch behind FRR that now has grass. In fact, the Pierce K1 play space has grass that's right on the top of the town hall parking garage. And
you said grass, did you mean turf?
I meant turf, excuse me.
Yeah.
And now there's a conversation around Driscoll when that construction is done and they remove the old building and lay out some play space, whether or not that would be grass or turf. And so it sort of came to a head in town meeting with Articles 23 and 24, competing articles on the topic. Give us a sense on what the viewpoints were.
Right. And it also, you've forgotten that it came to a town meeting in an amendment to the budget article as well, to prohibit use of capital funds for turf at Skyline, and that was rejected. This is a pretty complicated and somewhat passionate debate, and it involves two kind of orthogonal points of view. So it's not really a head-to-head. Pretty much everybody in the town agrees that plastics, particularly in the form of PFAS, provide health dangers, and that there are legitimate questions about the heat island effect associated with putting turf fields in place of natural grass, and also effects on local habitat and the like. how does it affect trees? How does it affect local animals and things like that? The proponents of using turf in certain situations are almost entirely, as far as I can tell, motivated by the desire to have play spaces available for children that are open more often than the grass fields in Brookline tend to be open. And so the opponents of turf cite medical and health studies that talk about climate change, health risks associated with the consumption of or exposure to plastics, and the heat island effects that might make both the environment more uncomfortable, but also more difficult for people to play on the fields. And the proponents of grass fields cite the overwhelming number of days in the year that seem to be increasing as a result of increased precipitation or changes in precipitation patterns that cause the natural grass fields to be closed. And so therefore having children unavailable to play. And then also when they are playing, they're playing on mud, and there have been citations of injuries associated with that. And as far as I can tell, both sides are right. And so that's why this debate ends up being incredibly fraught, because it's very hard to argue with someone who is actually correct. And so the question comes in all cases as to how do you balance the needs of those two particular sides. And that's where Warrant Article 23 came into play, which was to say, can we establish a task force that is going to look at all of this information and try to reach a set of recommendations that can take into account those conflicting needs, and make a set of recommendations, guidelines for how the town would move forward, and then ideally make that recommendation prior to the drop dead date, after which it would be impossible to revise a decision about what's going to happen at Driscoll.
And that warrant article passed 209-33 with 8 abstentions. And did it give a timeline for this study with several years?
No, it's supposed to happen later this year. It's supposed to come back with the recommendation. I don't remember the exact date, so I wouldn't want to misspeak, but later this year in time to influence what happens at Driscoll.
That's going to be quick. And then
yes, it will be quick. That was one of the objections that people had.
Yeah, Article 24 is a little tighter. It passed 149-94 to 8. And what did Warrant Article 24 assert?
Well, Warrant Article 24 didn't pass. The referral motion on Warrant Article 24 passed. The Warrant Article 24 was intended to prevent the installation of any new turf field in Brookline, with a few exceptions. Most notably, the exceptions that you had cited earlier, fields that are already in place would be able to be repaired. Or actually, it was put a moratorium on to be technical, it was put a moratorium on the installation of fields, not to ban them outright forever. What ended up passing was a referral of that, just like the previous discussion, a referral of the subject matter of that warrant article, and it was referred to the commission that was established under Warrant Article 23. So the idea is that in some number of months, a commission that's been established will come back and make recommendations, including a recommendation on how and whether we should install turf in the future. And ideally, if a recommendation was made either way, whether to install turf or not to install turf, what are the kinds of new information we would hope to be able to get that might cause that decision to be revised in the future?
Well, they've got a long way to go in a short time to get there. We're going to move on to leaf blowers, which was Article 27 this time around, but certainly town meeting has debated leaf blowers many times. My hunch is that people who liked grass in Articles 23 and 24 like rakes, and people who like turf like leaf blowers, but maybe it's not quite that simple. What was the nuance in this go around on the leaf blower warrant article?
So the biggest nuance in this go around to prior, so there's historically been the debate, and I have unwary analysis, but my guess is that that, the closer you are to the denser parts of North Brookline, the more opposed you are to leaf blowers, and the closer you are to areas that have larger yards and more trees, the more supportive of leaf blowers you are. I don't think that's a hard and fast rule, but it wouldn't surprise me if it played out that way.
Well, and a young PhD student in town meeting at the time actually made a presentation about why that might be, because it turns out that walls make leaf blowers sound louder, and that multiple leaf blowers in a small space, which you would find in a North Brookline lot as opposed to a South Brookline lot, also make leaf blowers sound louder. And so,
So that's a really good segue, Mr. PhD. Into the differences this time around. So in the past, the leaf blower articles either proposed an out-and-out ban on leaf blowers, with the exception of for use by the town, which always provided some grist for frustration amongst town meeting members. Why should the town be allowed to assault me with the sound of leaf blowers, but I'm not allowed to use them myself, that sort of thing. But also, or they were very formulaic about trying to prescribe specific time periods when leaf blowers could be used, and leaf blowers of different types. And it's generally recognized that the time intervals don't work very well. It's very hard for somebody to tell across the street whether it's a gas-powered leaf blower or a leaf or an electric leaf blower, or to remember whether the ban has gone into effect or not, and if it has gone into effect, remembering which days of the week, which hours the bans are in effect. So and then it also turns out that enforcement of those involved asking a human being associated with the town to come out and observe the offending leaf blower user in action, which often was impractical because they'd be done by the time somebody was able to show up and see it. This time around, the proposal was quite different. It was simply get rid of gasoline-powered leaf blowers altogether and require the use of electric leaf blowers, under the theory that in the past 5 or 6 years, battery technology has gotten better, leaf blower technology has gotten better, and it is possible to select and use battery-powered leaf blowers that work almost as well as the gasoline-powered ones, and which are known to produce far less noise and far less, to your earlier point, noise that causes people to react negatively. People react more negatively to the engines of gasoline-powered leaf blowers than they do to the motors of electric ones.
But the meeting was not persuaded. It failed 95 to 127 with 18 abstentions. And I'm going to take a moment to point out that, if you're not the owner of a leaf blower company, or maybe even a landscaper, I have a hard time understanding why you might have abstained, moderator and town clerk notwithstanding. Abstentions are typically for folks who have an ethical reason why they shan't vote, not because they can't make up their mind. But nevertheless, 95 were in favor and 127 were opposed. And so that means we keep the status quo, which is this electric leaf blowers are allowed all the time, gas-powered leaf blowers are allowed some of the time, and depends on the season and the hour of the day and the day of the week. And that's what we've kept.
That's what we've kept. It came out during the hearings that the only way to keep I don't want to say the only way, but town meeting has passed a number of enforcement provisions over the past few years, but it does not increase the enforcement budget from the various departments. And so the agencies of the town that are responsible for enforcing things like the leaf blower ban are stretched quite thin. And so the recommendation has been made that if we're going to keep bans like this in place, where you require a complaint-driven process that requires a human being to come out and assess and possibly issue a fine, that we need to add more staff. And so My expectation is that, in an upcoming, whether it's next fiscal year or whether it's an adjustment to the budget that might happen later this year, that some, additional resources for enforcement are going to be proposed, because we're kind of in an untenable position otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have too much time left, but we're going to give it a shot. The last topic I want to talk about was warrant articles 34 and 35, and they were both resolutions relating to non-public electronic communications associated with town meeting. And this really is angels on the head of a pin. This is town meeting, navel gazing itself, right? Looking at town meeting and discussing.
No comment.
Discussing, we'd really like you to do the following thing, but of course have no legal authority to require you to do or not do this thing. And maybe you could at least just tell us what the two things are and get us started.
Right. The two things had to do with, so without going into the details, because they're complicated and somewhat confusing, Massachusetts has open meeting law, which requires deliberations to be made in public. And that applies to quorums of committees. You basically can't have a non-public debate or deliberation. The public has to see everything. In true confusing fashion, those restrictions don't apply to town meeting, but they do apply to lots of committees on which many town meeting members serve. And so there's a constant debate about whether or not conversations that happen amongst substantial minorities of town meeting members constitute public deliberations in their own right. What the precipitating event was that in a recent town meeting, it was revealed that an electronic communication channel called WhatsApp was being used by a large number of town meeting members to discuss the proceedings. And while there are open questions about what was actually discussed, whether it was mostly procedural, whether it was clarifying, or whether it was actually strategy, many town meeting members viewed that as a discussion that ought to be open to the public at large, because the public can watch the public deliberations of town meeting, but it obviously can't watch the private deliberations that take place over WhatsApp. And so the WhatsApp or the electronic communications resolution was intended to express that there is the will of town meeting that those types of discussions should not be allowed. And to your angels on the head of a pin comment, a lot of the debate was around how do you draw the line? Does three people talking over a town meeting cookie constitute a deliberation that should no longer happen? What if I didn't hear what somebody said and I asked for a clarification? What if I text my friend to ask them how they're voting? All things that every town meeting member has done at one time or another, are those considered to be within the purview or not? Town meeting ultimately decided that it wanted to express its preference that town meeting members not engage in these sorts of discussions. But as you say, there's no enforcement mechanism and there's no penalty for failure to comply. That was warrant article 34. Warrant article 34.
And that one passed 117-112 with 14 abstentions.
Right. Again, to your point, it's hard to imagine how you couldn't have an opinion on this after having been in town meeting for a while and observing this. And in this case, the number of abstentions exceeded the margin. And right. So it's hard to, clearly town meeting is quite divided on this topic though.
Yeah. And then the other one related to the Town Meeting Members Association listserv, which maybe you could quickly tell us what it is, and we'll get to that outcome too, but we're just about out of time. So we're gonna get through it.
Town Meeting Members Association list is an email discussion list that involves all town meeting members and the moderator and possibly one or two town officials for the purposes of notification. It exists to be a venue where town meeting members can communicate with each other. You might ask the question, how is that different from it is not open to the public. And in the run up to town meeting, there are very clearly deliberations which take place on that discussion list. And so many members of town meeting do not participate because they are also members of bodies that are subject to the open meeting law and therefore feel that they cannot weigh in. the argument has been made for years. It has been rejected for years, but there's been growing support for it over the years that all those discussions should be available to the public, so that the public can see what the town meeting members are discussing. And that resolution also passed at town meeting. I don't have the exact number in front of me.
113-98 with 23 abstentions.
So it's exactly the same. You know, it's a very tightly contested article, and a lot of the arguments have to do with logistically whether it is easy or hard to open it up. But also the question of whether people should have the ability to embarrass themselves by asking questions for clarification and not have that open to the public. Like basically small procedural things. Like, I don't mind tapping you on the shoulder and saying, Tommy, I just missed that. What's going on? But I might be embarrassed to do that if I were doing it over out on the internet at large.
Well, and of course the TMMA listserv has something on the order of 250, maybe 275 members, any of whom could forward any of the emails to anyone, including just take a screenshot and put it on the internet. And so
Right.
there's nothing about it which is inherently private or secret or has that expectation explicitly. So again, it's this sort of strange space. Of course, the TMMA is a private organization. It is not a part of the town government. And so, whereas in Article 34, the town meeting resolved to tell itself, its own members, what to do.
Right.
35, they resolved to tell a private organization made up of its own members what to do. So a slight difference there.
Right. That was one of the primary objections that some people had in objecting to Article 35 on principle, was simply the town meeting should not be telling a single organization what to do, even if they believe that organization ought to be doing that on its own initiative. And one of the primary arguments in favor of warrant Article 35 was what you just said, which is that you have to treat these communications as potentially open to the public. And there is a sense, it has not been adjudicated, but there is a sense on the part of town council that many of the discussions that happen on that discussion list may be public records, subject to freedom of information or public records disclosure requests anyway. And so they would have to be maintained and disclosed. And so the easiest way to do that would just be to automatically disclose them as they happen.
Well, in both cases, they were resolutions, and so they're non-binding. They did both pass. And now we've got the summer to figure out our communication strategies, to figure out grass versus turf, and even to figure out whether or not our November town meeting will be in person, as the law presently requires, or whether or not an extension on the COVID era provisions will be extended again. And that is a question that I, the show's host, will probably have a feel for before most people in Brookline, because it's the state legislature who's going to take that vote. And that vote is coming hopefully in June, maybe in early July, and more to come. In any case, go ahead.
Would such a vote have any impact on other town departments, such as, for example, the advisory committee, which is currently going to have one more virtual meeting, but then is scheduled to take up hybrid?
It would. There's a conversation wherein the July 15th deadline, which is the termination date of a long list of COVID era adjustments to process, including things like notary publics, right? It's not just narrow town government meetings, but it includes both public meetings, public hearings, and representative town meeting, whether or not that date will be extended or not. And frankly, it's a bit of a toss-up. There are folks in the building who have strong feelings one way or the other. But in this building, there's no referral. We're going to make a decision, and we'll either do it or we won't. And you'll find out soon enough. But if I were you, I'd be prepared to be meeting in person.
Oh, we are.
Because that may just be the way it goes. And keep in mind, we've got classrooms full of kids in public schools. We have commuter rails and subways full of people. The idea that we can't meet in person, it's about maybe a little softer than that, but we'll figure it out and we'll find out. And we're out of time.
Okay.
So, Advisory Committee Chair Dennis Doughty, thank you so much for coming on Brookline Interactive Group and helping us with a recap of town meeting, and enjoy a few weeks off this summer before you get back into it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Be well.